With us is Terri McDonald. She is the Chief Officer of the Probations Department for the County of Los Angeles, the largest office of its kind in the nation, over 6,000 probation officers. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you were at the forefront of this criminal justice reform effort. Before we get any further, for those folks out there who don't appreciate what you do, describe it.
So I'm the Chief Probation Officer for Los Angeles County, and probation works in the courts. So, for example, we write court reports when folks are being sentenced. We work in the jails, working with the courts to see whether or not we can do bail deviation, helping folks reach bail if they're not high risk. We work with kids in the community, whether in placement centers. We run juvenile halls and camps, and of course we supervise nearly 40,000 adults under supervision on behalf of the court.
Somebody who's been arrested, either an adult or a juvenile, you're trying to keep them from going back into custody.
Correct. And if they've been in custody, we're working with them so that they don't end up committing crimes and going back in.
When people talk about, and we hear this throughout the campaign for president, that is mass incarceration and criminal justice reform, what do you think of when you hear that phrase?
Well, I have the benefit of being a correctional officer in the 80s. So I started my law enforcement career in the state correctional system, where I started out as an officer and I worked my way all the way up to undersecretary, overseeing the state parole, prison, and juvenile justice system. And what happened in California, and frankly across the nation, was this tough on crime initiative where gangs are coming up, drugs are coming up, and the response to that is an ever-increasing harshness in sentencing and a reduction in the public health approach towards.
Was it racial?
Well, there's disproportionality in who's arrested. Like in my juvenile halls and camps, it's most, not arrested, but ends up in detention, are disproportionate black and brown. So you see this kind of moving away from a health approach towards what drives people into crime and more of a detention approach. The good news is in the last decade and really the last 5 years or so, you're seeing that begin to recede backwards, where we're working with mental health and we're working with addiction and we're dealing with homelessness and we're doing trauma-informed practices, because you just can't incarcerate your way out of dealing with the social issues that drive people to criminal behavior.
Should cash bail be eliminated in California?
From my perspective, yes.
Why?
Well, because it's unfair. And so what happens I ran the jails here. You may have two people in jail. One of them has committed a serious violent crime. They're actively involved in active crime and predatory behavior towards citizens, but they have the money to post bail. Next to them will be a homeless person who's got an addiction problem, who doesn't have a dime. They've committed a much more minor crime. They're not terrorizing the community in such a predatory way. They stay in jail, and then the predatory criminal ends up out on bail.
You were requested by the LA County Board of Supervisors to get rid of pepper spray in juvenile halls and juvenile camps. And they said by the end of the year. You have now said it's going to happen in September, maybe of 2020, at a cost of $39 million. Explain that.
Yeah, let me talk it in deeper meaning about what the board's really asked us to do. When you talked earlier about mass incarceration, the other thing that happened in the 80s was this: kids were super predators. And so we began to incarcerate all kinds of young people. Much work has been done in the last decade to reduce reliance on detention for young people. In Los Angeles County, what we have in detention are some really high-need young people. Most of them have a violent history. 90% of them had involvement with the child welfare system. A lot of gang activity. Many of them have a mental health diagnosis.
So you have agents who have a pepper spray because they say they need it, but and the board wants that removed.
What we want to do is to deal with the underlying behavior that drives the young people act in a way that staff are required or feel required to use pepper spray. It's training, it's more staff, it's more mental health staff, it's a ton more program, it's cleaning up the facilities. They were built in a time in which command and control of young people was the order of the day.
Right.
We want to talk about trauma-informed practices and treatment.
The Los Angeles Times editorial board last month said there's no reason juveniles should be held in the same department that adult criminals are supervised, that you should break up the county probation department, that they don't need probation officers. Juveniles need counselors, they need teachers. Do you agree with the idea that your department needs to be broken up?
So juveniles do need counselors and teachers. They need mental health clinicians, but they also are under the court supervision by probation. The board did ask an outside entity to take a look at breaking up the department, because it is a big department. The recommendation was it's more complicated to break it up because there's a lot of overlap in services between the juvenile and adult, and then where do the 18 to 25-year-olds land? But I think it's something the board will continue to consider as they move forward.
Terri McDonald is Chief Officer of the Probations Department for the County of Los Angeles. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For taking the time.
Good to see you.
We'll have more after this.